What would you do if you found out the person who promised to take care of you after you came home from war was the one making sure you never recovered? That every pill she gave you kept you sedated, every lie she told kept you isolated, and every dollar the Army paid you went into an account you did not know existed. Now imagine discovering that she was planning to make your death look like just another veteran suicide statistic. And the only person standing between you and that plan was your 17-year-old son. Nathan Reed had not left his house in 11 days. He knew this because his son Jake had started keeping a tally on the whiteboard in the kitchen, the one that used to track grocery lists and soccer practice schedules, and now tracked the number of consecutive days since Nathan had stepped outside the front door. The current number was 11, written in Jake's neat block letters with a blue dry erase marker. It was not the longest streak. The record was 23 days, set in February, when a car backfired on Maple Court and the sound sent Nathan crawling into the hallway closet, where he sat on a pile of winter boots with his hands over his ears for 45 minutes. Nathan Reed was 42 years old, a former Army Sergeant First Class with 20 years of service and 3 combat deployments to Afghanistan, and he was now a man who could not hear a door slam without flinching. 3 years ago, an improvised explosive device had detonated 14 meters from his patrol vehicle on a road outside Kandahar, killing 2 members of his squad and leaving Nathan with a traumatic brain injury, permanent hearing loss in his left ear, and a case of post-traumatic stress disorder so severe that his psychiatrist at Walter Reed had described it in his medical notes as among the most treatment-resistant presentations I have encountered in 18 years of practice. Before the IED, Nathan had been the kind of soldier that other soldiers wanted to serve with. He was calm under fire, meticulous in planning, and possessed the rare ability to make junior enlisted soldiers feel both respected and accountable. He had been awarded the Bronze Star for actions during his second deployment, when he had led a 12-man squad through an ambush in Helmand Province that lasted 47 minutes and resulted in 0 American casualties. His commanding officers had told him repeatedly that he was on track for promotion to Master Sergeant, possibly even Sergeant Major, if he kept his current trajectory. His wife Diane had framed every commendation letter, every certificate of achievement, every photograph of Nathan in dress uniform, and hung them in a gallery wall arrangement in the living room that she showed to every visitor who walked through the door. "My husband is a hero," she would say, her voice carrying the practiced warmth of a woman who had perfected the role of military spouse over 20 years. Nathan would stand quietly beside her during these performances, his arm around her waist, uncomfortable with the attention but grateful for the pride she took in his service. He had married Diane when he was 22 and she was 20, 2 months after they met at a barbecue hosted by a mutual friend in Clarksville, Tennessee, just outside the gates of Fort Campbell, where Nathan was stationed with the 101st Airborne Division. Their son Jake had been born 3 years into the marriage, when Nathan was 25 and Diane was 23. Jake was now 17, a junior at Clarksville High School, and he had grown into a young man who combined his father's quiet determination with an analytical sharpness that neither parent could fully explain. He ran cross-country, maintained a 3.8 GPA, and had recently been accepted into the school's dual enrollment program with Austin Peay State University, where he planned to take criminal justice courses in the fall. Jake had always been close to his father, but the closeness had changed in texture since Nathan's return from Afghanistan. Before the IED, their relationship had been built on shared activities, fishing trips to Kentucky Lake, Sunday football on the couch, working on the 1969 Chevelle that Nathan was slowly restoring in the garage. Now the relationship was built on caretaking. Jake cooked dinner most nights because Nathan's hands shook too badly to handle a knife safely. Jake drove Nathan to his rare appointments because Nathan could no longer tolerate the sensory overload of traffic. Jake had learned to recognize the difference between the 3 kinds of silence his father practiced: the quiet of exhaustion, the quiet of memory, and the quiet that came just before a panic attack, which required Jake to speak in a low, steady voice and guide Nathan to a dark room. Diane managed everything else, or so she said. She handled the finances, the insurance, the mail, the phone calls from the VA that she claimed to field on Nathan's behalf. She was the interface between Nathan and the outside world, the translator who converted his needs into bureaucratic action. When Nathan asked about his discharge paperwork, which he did periodically in his more lucid moments, Diane would pat his hand and say, "It's all taken care of, honey. I filed everything with the separation office. You're officially retired. Your pension is set up. Don't worry about any of it." Nathan accepted this because he trusted his wife, and because the administrative details of military separation were a labyrinth of acronyms and forms that overwhelmed him even before the TBI had compromised his cognitive processing. There had been moments, brief flickers of clarity in the fog of Nathan's condition, when something about Diane's behavior had seemed slightly off. Once, about a year after his return, Nathan had asked Diane for the phone number of his old platoon sergeant, Ray Dominguez, because he wanted to check in on the guys from the unit. Diane had told him that Ray had transferred to a duty station in Germany and was unreachable, which was strange because Ray had told Nathan before the deployment that he was planning to retire at Fort Campbell. Another time, Nathan had asked to see his DD-214, the discharge certificate that every veteran received upon separation from the military, and Diane had said it was filed with the county clerk and she would get him a copy. But the copy never materialized. Nathan had let both matters drop, because pressing the issue required cognitive energy he no longer possessed, and because questioning Diane felt like questioning the one stable structure in a world that had become frighteningly unstable. He did not know that his wife was lying. He did not know that his discharge had never been filed. He did not know that he was still, according to every database in the Department of Defense, an active duty soldier assigned to the Soldier Recovery Unit at Fort Campbell, drawing full military pay that he had never seen and would never see, because every dollar of it was flowing into a bank account that Diane controlled and Nathan did not know existed. It was a Thursday afternoon in early November when Jake found the envelope. He was checking the mailbox at the end of the driveway, something he did every day after school because Diane had recently started collecting the mail before Jake got home, a behavior change that Jake had noticed but not yet questioned. Today, Diane's car was not in the driveway. She had left a note on the kitchen counter saying she had a dentist appointment in Nashville, 70 miles away, an appointment that seemed to require an overnight bag, which Jake had also noticed and also not yet questioned. The mailbox contained a credit card offer, a flyer for a lawn care service, and a white envelope from the Defense Finance and Accounting Service, addressed to Sergeant First Class Nathan J. Reed. Jake knew what DFAS was. Every military kid knew DFAS. It was the agency that processed military pay. His father had been discharged 3 years ago. There was no reason for DFAS to be sending him anything. Jake opened the envelope and found a leave and earnings statement, the military equivalent of a pay stub, showing a direct deposit of $6,712 made 4 days ago to an account at a bank called Volunteer Federal Credit Union. Jake had never heard of Volunteer Federal Credit Union. His family banked at USAA, like every other military family on post. He read the statement twice, then a third time, and then he sat down on the front steps of the house with the paper in his hands and a feeling in his chest like someone had poured cold water directly into his lungs. The LES showed Nathan's rank as E7, his years of service as 23, his duty station as SRU, Fort Campbell, Kentucky, and his pay status as active duty. 23 years of service meant the Army believed Nathan had been serving continuously since he enlisted at 19, with no break, no discharge, no retirement, for the past 23 years, including the 3 years since he had physically returned from Afghanistan and not set foot on a military installation. Jake knew his father had not been to Fort Campbell since the day he was released from the Soldier Recovery Unit's care, which Diane said had happened within weeks of his return. He knew his father had not worn a uniform, had not attended a formation, had not spoken to anyone in his chain of command, had not done anything remotely resembling military service for 36 months. And yet the United States Army was still paying him $6,712 every month, depositing it into an account that was not the family's USAA account, at a credit union that Jake had never heard his parents mention. Jake went inside, locked the front door, and walked past his father's recliner, where Nathan was asleep under a weighted blanket with the television on mute. He went to his room, closed the door, opened his laptop, and typed Volunteer Federal Credit Union, Clarksville, Tennessee, into the search bar. The credit union was real. It was a small institution on Madison Street, about 4 miles from the house, with 3 branches and a website that looked like it had been designed in 2008. Jake could not access the account without a login, and he did not have one. But the LES in his hand contained the last 4 digits of the account number, 7734. Jake opened a calculator app on his phone and did the arithmetic that would define the next chapter of his life. $6,712 per month times 36 months equaled $241,632. $250,000 had been deposited into an account his father knew nothing about, paid by the United States Army for service his father was not performing, during a period when his father believed he had been honorably discharged. Someone was stealing Nathan Reed's military pay, and the only person who had told Nathan that his discharge was all taken care of was the same person who handled every piece of mail, every phone call, every financial document that entered or left the Reed household. Jake did not want to believe what the math was telling him. He wanted there to be an innocent explanation, a bureaucratic error, a delayed direct deposit, anything. But the LES was dated 4 days ago. This was not a backlog. This was current. This was happening right now. Jake walked back inside and looked at his father, asleep in the recliner with the weighted blanket pulled up to his chin, his face twitching slightly in whatever dream or memory was playing behind his closed eyes. This was a man who had earned a Bronze Star for keeping 12 soldiers alive in an ambush. This was a man who had spent 20 years serving his country and had come home broken in ways that no medal could fix. And someone was stealing from him. Jake felt a heat rising in his chest that he recognized not as anger, but as resolve. The same quality that his father had once described as the difference between a good soldier and a great one. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Jake went to his room, opened a new folder on his laptop, and titled it with the date and 2 words, Dad's Case. Then he began to plan. Jake spent the next 72 hours gathering information with the methodical intensity of someone who understood, even at 17, that accusations without evidence were just noise. His first call was to the Army Human Resources Command in Fort Knox, Kentucky. He identified himself as the son of Sergeant First Class Nathan Reed and said he was trying to verify his father's service status for a college financial aid application. The clerk on the phone, a civilian named Mrs. Patterson, pulled up Nathan's record and confirmed what the LES had already told Jake in black and white. Your father is currently listed as active duty, assigned to the Soldier Recovery Unit at Fort Campbell. His MEB is still pending review. Jake felt the floor shift beneath him. He kept his voice steady and asked when the last action on his father's medical evaluation board had been logged. Mrs. Patterson clicked through several screens and said, "The most recent entry is a quarterly progress review signed by," she paused, "Master Sergeant Victor Hale, dated October 15th of this year." That was 3 weeks ago. Someone named Victor Hale had signed a progress review for a soldier who had not been on a military installation in 3 years. Jake wrote down every word Mrs. Patterson had said, including the date of the progress review and Victor Hale's name, spelling it back to her twice to make sure he had it right. After hanging up, he sat at his desk for several minutes, processing what he had just learned. His father's MEB, the medical evaluation board that should have led to his honorable discharge and medical retirement with full VA benefits, had been deliberately stalled in the system for 3 years. Someone was signing quarterly progress reviews, certifying that a soldier who had not set foot on a military installation was still receiving active treatment and making progress toward a disposition. This was not a clerical error. This was a calculated, sustained manipulation of the Army's personnel system by someone who knew exactly how to keep a ghost soldier on the books without triggering the automated safeguards that were designed to catch exactly this kind of fraud. Jake searched for Victor Hale on the Fort Campbell Global Address List, which was publicly accessible through the Army's website. Master Sergeant Victor D. Hale was listed as the Personnel Administration NCOIC for the Soldier Recovery Unit. His office was in Building 6847 on Indiana Avenue. Jake's next move was to search the house. He waited until Saturday morning, when Diane announced she was going to the outlet mall in Opry Mills with her friend Karen, a trip that typically lasted 5 to 6 hours. Nathan was in his recliner as always, drowsing in front of a muted television. Jake started with Diane's home office, a converted spare bedroom at the end of the upstairs hallway that she kept locked when she was not inside it. Jake had learned to pick simple pin tumbler locks 2 years ago when he lost the key to his bicycle lock, using a technique he had practiced from a YouTube video and a set of bobby pins. The office door took him less than 40 seconds. Inside, the room was obsessively organized. A white desk with a closed laptop, a filing cabinet with 4 drawers, and a corkboard on the wall covered with sticky notes in color-coded clusters. Jake started with the filing cabinet. The first drawer contained tax returns and utility bills. The second contained insurance documents. The third was locked. The fourth contained what appeared to be old photo albums and birthday cards. Jake picked the lock on the third drawer and found, beneath a false bottom made from a piece of cardboard cut to fit the drawer's dimensions, a collection of documents that answered every question he had been asking and raised a dozen more that were far worse. The first document was a set of bank statements from Volunteer Federal Credit Union, account number ending in 7734, in the name of Diane M. Reed. The statements covered the past 12 months and showed monthly deposits of $6,712 from DFAS, exactly matching the LES Jake had found in the mailbox. They also showed monthly withdrawals, $2,000 transferred to a checking account at the same credit union, $1,500 in cash withdrawals from ATMs in Clarksville and Nashville, and recurring payments to a storage unit facility called Secure Vault on Wilma Rudolph Boulevard. The account balance as of the most recent statement was $63,418. The rest of the money, Jake calculated, roughly $178,000 over 3 years, had already been spent or moved elsewhere. The second document was a printout of Nathan's service record from IPPSA, the Army's personnel database, showing his status as active duty, SRU, non-deployable, MEB pending. Someone had annotated this printout in handwriting that was not Diane's, writing notes in blue ink next to certain fields. Update quarterly, next to the progress review date. Rotate provider names, next to the medical appointment log. And do not exceed E7 pay ceiling, next to the rank field. The handwriting belonged to someone who understood the military personnel system from the inside. The third document stopped Jake's breath. It was a life insurance policy from a company called Guardian Shield Assurance, insuring Nathan's life for $500,000. The policy had been taken out 2 years ago. Diane was listed as the sole beneficiary. The application listed Nathan's occupation as active duty, U.S. Army, and his health status as good, no pre-existing conditions, which was a lie on both counts since Nathan had been diagnosed with severe PTSD, TBI, and partial hearing loss. The policy had been notarized by a man named Craig Wesson, whose title was listed as Licensed Insurance Agent, State of Tennessee. Jake photographed every page of every document with his phone, his hands steady despite the adrenaline that was making his vision pulse at the edges. He replaced everything exactly as he had found it, restacked the false cardboard bottom, closed and relocked the third drawer, checked the other drawers to make sure nothing was disturbed, and relocked the office door with the same bobby pins he had used to open it. He went to his room, closed the door, and sat on his bed. He opened the photographs on his phone's camera roll and scrolled through them slowly, one by one. And each image felt like a door opening into a room he had not known existed in his own house. The bank statements were damning. The annotated personnel record was incriminating. But the insurance policy was something else entirely. Jake had watched enough true crime documentaries and read enough case studies in his dual enrollment criminal justice class to recognize the pattern. Financial exploitation escalating to insurance fraud with a hidden beneficiary clause. The trajectory was not ambiguous. It pointed in one direction. Jake stared at the policy's beneficiary line, where his mother's name was printed in clean black type, and understood for the first time in his life that love and danger could live in the same person, in the same house, at the same kitchen table where he had eaten breakfast that morning. His mother was stealing his father's military pay. She was doing it with the help of someone inside the Army's personnel system. And she had taken out a $500,000 life insurance policy on a man with severe PTSD, a man who she had systematically isolated from every support system that might have helped him recover. A man who, Jake now realized with a clarity that made him physically nauseous, was worth more to his mother dead than alive. Jake needed to understand the full scope of the conspiracy before he could decide what to do. Over the following week, he conducted a series of carefully planned investigations that exploited the one advantage he had over his mother. She did not know he was looking. He started with Victor Hale. A search of public records through the Montgomery County Clerk's website revealed that Victor Hale owned a 2024 Chevrolet Tahoe, registered to an address on Rossview Road, a purchase that seemed ambitious for a master sergeant's salary of approximately $72,000 per year. Jake cross-referenced Victor's name with Diane's phone records, which he accessed by resetting the family's Verizon account password through Diane's personal email, whose login he had figured out by trying the name of her childhood dog, followed by her birth year, a combination he had overheard her recite to a customer service representative months earlier, and found that Diane and Victor had exchanged 1,437 text messages in the past 6 months, an average of roughly 8 per day. He also found 23 phone calls between them, all made during the hours when Nathan was typically asleep or sedated by his anxiety medication. Jake did not have access to the content of the text messages, but the volume alone told a story that required no translation. His mother and the man who was keeping his father's ghost file active in the Army's system were in constant, intimate communication. The question was whether the intimacy was purely criminal or also personal. He got his answer 3 days later. On Tuesday afternoon, Diane announced she was going to a PTA meeting at Jake's school. Jake knew there was no PTA meeting because he had checked the school's event calendar that morning. Instead of confronting her, he waited 15 minutes after she left and then drove his father's old pickup truck, which Nathan no longer used, to the parking lot of a Starbucks on Madison Street that he had noticed was directly across from Volunteer Federal Credit Union. He parked facing the credit union's entrance and waited. At 4:27, Diane's silver Honda Accord pulled into the credit union's parking lot. She went inside for 11 minutes, presumably to make a transaction. When she came out, she did not get back in her car. Instead, she walked to a black Chevrolet Tahoe parked 3 spaces away, opened the passenger door, and got in. Through his phone's camera, zoomed to maximum, Jake could see the driver, a broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s, wearing a military-style haircut and a polo shirt. Jake took 14 photographs in rapid succession as the Tahoe pulled out of the lot. He got clear shots of the license plate, which he already knew was registered to Victor Hale. As the Tahoe turned onto Madison Street, Jake caught one final image through the rear window. Diane leaning across the center console, her hand on Victor's shoulder, her face turned toward his in a gesture that removed any remaining ambiguity about the nature of their relationship. His mother was sleeping with the man who was defrauding the United States Army on her behalf. The following afternoon, Jake had his closest call. He was in Diane's office for a second time, photographing the corkboard sticky notes which contained what appeared to be a coded schedule of Victor's shift rotations and planned appointments in Nashville when he heard the front door open downstairs. Diane was not supposed to be home for another 3 hours. Jake's blood went cold. He heard her voice calling from the kitchen. "Jake, are you home?" He had exactly 45 seconds. He put his phone in his pocket, closed the filing cabinet drawer, checked that nothing was visibly disturbed, and slipped out of the office, pulling the door shut behind him as quietly as he could. He walked quickly to the bathroom across the hall, flushed the toilet, and ran the faucet. When Diane appeared at the top of the stairs 30 seconds later, Jake was walking out of the bathroom, drying his hands on a towel. "Hey, Mom," he said, his voice perfectly calm despite the fact that his heart was hammering so hard he was certain she could hear it. "You're home early." Diane looked at him for a moment, then glanced down the hallway toward her office. The door was closed, as she had left it. "Karen got a migraine," she said. "We cut the trip short." She walked past him to her office, produced a key from her pocket, unlocked the door, and went inside. Jake went to his room, sat on his bed, and waited for his hands to stop shaking. It took 7 minutes. He could not afford another close call like that. He needed to finish his investigation and get the evidence to someone with the authority to act. Jake spent 2 more days following the financial trail before he found the final piece of the puzzle. He called Guardian Shield Assurance from a prepaid phone purchased at Walmart for $22 and identified himself as Craig Wesson's assistant, asking to verify the status of policy number GS4471882, issued to Nathan Reed. The representative confirmed that the policy was active, premiums were current, and the 2-year contestability period had expired 2 months earlier. Jake asked, as casually as he could manage, whether there were any riders or special conditions on the policy. The representative said there was a standard suicide exclusion clause that had also expired with the contestability period, meaning that a death by suicide would now be covered under the full $500,000 benefit. Jake thanked her and hung up. He sat in the parking lot of the Walmart and thought about what he had just learned. The suicide exclusion had expired. His father had PTSD. His mother had isolated his father from every form of treatment, every support network, every human connection that might have given him a reason to fight through the darkness. And she had a $500,000 policy that would pay out in full if he died by his own hand. The only question Jake could not yet answer was when, not whether, they planned to make it happen. That question was answered the following evening. Jake had installed a voice-activated recording app on his phone and placed it inside a decorative bowl on the kitchen counter before going upstairs to his room. He told his mother he was studying for a calculus exam and would not be coming down for dinner. At 8:42 in the evening, the app captured a phone conversation between Diane and Victor that Jake would listen to later that night, with his door locked and his stomach turning. Victor's voice came through clearly. "The new battalion commander wants to audit all SRU personnel files next month. He's already asking questions about soldiers who've been in transition status for more than 18 months. Nathan's been on the books for 36. I can't hide him much longer." Diane's response was immediate. "Then we need to move up the timeline. Craig says the exclusion clause expired in September. If Nathan were to have an episode, a bad one, and if his medication were somehow easier to access than it should be, no one would question it. Half the guys in the SRU have thought about it. The VA's own statistics would back us up." There was a pause, and then Victor said, "You're talking about making it look like he did it himself." Diane said, "I'm talking about making sure our investment pays out before some colonel with a clipboard shuts down the whole operation. We've been doing this for 3 years, Victor. I am not walking away with nothing." Jake listened to the recording 3 times, sitting on his bedroom floor with his back against the door, tears running silently down his face and pooling in the collar of his shirt. His mother was planning to kill his father. Not with a weapon, not with poison, but by making his medication easier to access and engineering a situation where a man already drowning in PTSD would be nudged over the edge. It was the cruelest method Jake could imagine, because it would weaponize his father's own suffering against him. No one would investigate. PTSD veteran suicide was an epidemic in America, with an average of 17 veterans dying by suicide every single day, according to the VA's own reports. Nathan Reed would be a statistic, a tragic but unremarkable addition to a number that the country had already grown numb to. And Diane would collect $500,000, grieve convincingly at the funeral, and move on with Victor Hale to whatever life they had been building in the shadows of Nathan's illness. Jake saved the recording to 3 locations: his phone, a USB drive hidden in his cross-country bag, and a private cloud account. Then he made the most important decision of his 17 years on Earth. He was not going to let them kill his father. Jake's first act of protection was immediate and practical. That night, after Diane had gone to bed, he went to the kitchen where Nathan's medications were kept in a cabinet above the refrigerator, the cabinet that Diane had referenced when she talked about making medication easier to access. Nathan took 3 prescriptions: clonazepam for anxiety, prazosin for nightmares, and trazodone for sleep. All 3 were potentially lethal in overdose, especially in combination. Jake counted every pill in every bottle, wrote the numbers down, and photographed the bottles with their current fill levels. He then moved all 3 bottles to his cross-country bag, which he kept in his locked car. Every morning and every evening, he brought Nathan his prescribed doses personally, telling his father that he was helping Mom organize the medicine schedule. Nathan accepted this without question, because Jake was the one person whose motives he never doubted. Jake also began sleeping with his bedroom door open and a chair wedged against the wall in a position that gave him a direct line of sight to his father's recliner. He was not going to let his father out of his protective orbit until this was over. The next morning, Jake drove to the Criminal Investigation Division office at Fort Campbell. CID was the Army's felony investigative agency, the military equivalent of the FBI, and Jake chose them over the local police because the crimes involved active-duty military personnel, federal pay fraud, and documents housed in Department of Defense systems. He arrived at Building 3919 at 8:15 in the morning, showed his military-dependent ID to the guard at the gate, and asked to speak to an investigator about fraud involving military personnel records. The desk sergeant looked at him with the particular skepticism reserved for teenagers who walk into law enforcement offices making serious claims on school mornings. But CID protocol required every complaint to be documented, so Jake was escorted to a small conference room and introduced to Special Agent Lisa Fontaine, a civilian investigator in her early 40s with a direct manner and a handshake that could crack walnuts. Jake noticed that the walls of the conference room were lined with framed photographs of CID agents receiving commendations and plaques commemorating closed cases involving everything from contract fraud to homicide. This was a room where serious accusations were taken seriously, and Jake felt a small measure of the weight lift from his shoulders for the first time in 2 weeks. He sat across from Agent Fontaine, placed his phone on the table between them, and said, "My father is Sergeant First Class Nathan Reed. He came home from Afghanistan 3 years ago. My mother told him she filed his discharge papers. She didn't. He's still on active duty in the system, and his pay has been going into an account he doesn't know about for 36 months. She's doing it with a master sergeant named Victor Hale from the SRU. They're also sleeping together. And last night, I recorded them planning to stage my father's suicide to collect a $500,000 insurance policy." Agent Fontaine, who had been taking notes with a calm, professional expression, stopped writing and looked up. She studied Jake's face for several seconds. Then she said, "Start from the beginning. Don't skip anything." Jake's briefing lasted 2 hours and 12 minutes. He presented every piece of evidence in chronological order: the LES from DFAS, the verification call to Army Human Resources confirming Nathan's active duty status, the bank statements from Volunteer Federal Credit Union showing 36 months of unauthorized deposits, the annotated IPPSA printout with handwritten instructions in what Jake believed was Victor Hale's writing, the insurance policy from Guardian Shield Assurance with its expired suicide exclusion clause, the photographs of Diane entering Victor's Tahoe at the credit union, the Verizon phone records showing 1,400 text messages between Diane and Victor, and the audio recording of Diane and Victor discussing the timeline for Nathan's staged suicide. Agent Fontaine listened without interrupting for the first hour, asking clarifying questions during the second hour that revealed both a deep familiarity with military personnel fraud and a growing comprehension of the case's scope. When Jake finished, Fontaine was quiet for a moment, reviewing her notes. Then she said, "I need to make 2 phone calls. The first is to our regional office at Fort Liberty to authorize a joint investigation with the FBI's Nashville field office, because this involves civilian insurance fraud that falls outside military jurisdiction. The second is to arrange immediate protective observation for your father. How soon can your mother get access to his medication unsupervised?" Jake said, "Anytime I'm at school." Fontaine picked up the phone. The investigation moved with the coordinated speed of 2 agencies that understood a life was at stake. Within 48 hours, CID and the FBI had obtained search warrants for Victor Hale's personnel records, his office computer at Building 6847, his personal devices, and his Rossview Road residence. They obtained parallel warrants for Diane's laptop, phone, the Volunteer Federal Credit Union account, and the Secure Vault storage unit on Wilma Rudolph Boulevard. Agent Fontaine also obtained an emergency order to place Nathan under informal protective observation by coordinating with Jake to ensure that Nathan was never left alone with Diane and that his medications were moved to a locked location that only Jake could access. Jake told his mother he was keeping the medications in a lockbox in his room. "Because I read that kids can accidentally access them," a lie that Diane accepted with visible irritation but no argument. Meanwhile, the FBI's Nashville field office sent agents to interview Craig Wesson, the insurance agent who had underwritten the Guardian Shield policy. Wesson, confronted with the forged medical questionnaire that listed Nathan as good health, no pre-existing conditions, crumbled within 11 minutes of questioning. He admitted that Diane had paid him $15,000 in cash to falsify the underwriting documents and skip the medical examination that would have revealed Nathan's PTSD, TBI, and hearing loss. Wesson provided a full written statement and agreed to cooperate with the prosecution in exchange for a reduced sentence. The search warrants were executed simultaneously at 6 in the morning on a Tuesday. At Building 6847 on Fort Campbell, CID agents entered Victor Hale's office with a digital forensics team and seized his government computer, 3 external hard drives, and a personal cell phone that Victor had hidden in the false bottom of his desk drawer. The computer contained the evidence that would ultimately prove most devastating to the defense. Victor had created 14 fictitious quarterly progress reviews for Nathan Reed over 3 years, each one bearing the forged signatures of medical providers who had never examined Nathan. Victor had also enrolled Nathan in the Army's community care program, which allowed soldiers to receive treatment from civilian providers outside the base, giving him a plausible explanation for why Nathan never appeared at any military facility. He had logged 26 fabricated medical appointments in IPPSA, listing both military and civilian providers, including real doctors at Blanchfield Army Community Hospital who, when later interviewed by CID, confirmed they had never seen Nathan Reed as a patient. He had manually overridden 3 automated system alerts that flagged Nathan's file for MEB processing delays, deleting the notifications from the queue before they could reach the battalion commander's inbox. And he had, in a particularly damning piece of evidence, created a spreadsheet on his personal hard drive titled Monthly Reconciliation that tracked every DFAS deposit into the Volunteer Federal Credit Union account, with a column labeled VH Share, showing his $1,500 monthly cut totaling $54,000 over 3 years. At the Reed residence, FBI agents arrived while Jake was eating cereal in the kitchen, having been warned the previous night by Agent Fontaine to expect them. Diane was upstairs getting dressed. When two agents knocked on the bedroom door, identified themselves, and presented the arrest warrant, Diane Reed did something that Jake would remember for the rest of his life. She did not ask what the charges were. She did not proclaim her innocence. She did not ask to see her husband or her son. She walked to her closet, took out a pre-packed overnight bag that she had apparently kept ready for exactly this contingency, and said to the agents, "I want to speak to my attorney before I answer any questions." She had been prepared for this day. She had known, on some level, that the operation could not last forever, and she had planned her exit the way she had planned everything else in this conspiracy, calmly, methodically, and without a single flicker of the emotion that a normal person would feel when being arrested in front of their own family. Nathan was in his recliner in the living room. He watched Diane walk past him in handcuffs with an expression of bewildered incomprehension, his damaged brain struggling to process a scene that made no sense against the backdrop of the life he believed he was living. Jake stood beside his father's chair and said, quietly, "It's going to be okay, Dad. I'll explain everything. But right now, I need you to trust me." Nathan looked up at his son and nodded, because trusting Jake was the one thing his broken mind could still do without hesitation. Victor Hale was arrested at his home on Rossview Road 45 minutes later. Unlike Diane, Victor did not go quietly. He attempted to destroy his personal cell phone by throwing it into the kitchen sink and running the garbage disposal. A plan that failed because the disposal was broken and had been for 6 months, according to his landlord's maintenance records. He then attempted to flee through the back door, was stopped by 2 CID agents positioned in the backyard, and was subdued after a brief physical altercation that resulted in a resisting arrest charge and a bruised ego. Craig Wesson was arrested at his insurance office in Nashville by FBI agents later that morning. He was cooperative to the point of obsequiousness, immediately waiving his rights and confirming everything he had already told the agents during his earlier interview, including the $15,000 cash payment from Diane and the specific falsifications he had made on the underwriting documents. He provided his office records, his personal tax returns showing unreported income, and a handwritten letter from Diane instructing him on exactly which medical conditions to omit from the application. She was very specific, Wesson told the agents. She knew exactly what the underwriters would flag and what they would overlook. "I've been selling insurance for 22 years, and I've never had a client who understood the process better than she did." Nathan Reed was examined that same afternoon by Dr. Patricia Okafor, a VA psychiatrist who specialized in combat-related PTSD and had been briefed by Agent Fontaine on the circumstances of Nathan's case. What Dr. Okafor found was disturbing, but given the context, entirely predictable. Nathan had not received any professional mental health treatment since his return from Afghanistan 3 years earlier. Diane had told Nathan that she had enrolled him in a VA outpatient program, but no such enrollment existed in the VA system. She had told him that a VA social worker called the house weekly to check on him, but no social worker had ever been assigned to his case. She had told him that his psychiatrist at Walter Reed had recommended against group therapy and peer support programs, a recommendation that his actual psychiatrist had never made and that directly contradicted the treatment plan in his discharge summary. In short, Diane had built a wall between Nathan and every resource that could have helped him recover, ensuring that his PTSD remained untreated, his isolation remained total, and his dependence on her remained absolute. Dr. Okafor immediately enrolled Nathan in an intensive outpatient PTSD program at the Nashville VA Medical Center, starting with a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation, a medication review, and the beginning of prolonged exposure therapy, which was considered the gold standard treatment for combat-related PTSD. 3 years, Dr. Okafor said to Agent Fontaine after the initial assessment, shaking her head. "This man has been suffering without treatment for 3 years, while the system showed he was receiving care." Someone created an entire phantom treatment record. That is not just fraud. That is cruelty. The hardest moment came 2 days after the arrests, when Jake sat down with Nathan in the living room of Nathan's sister Sarah's house in Hopkinsville, where they were temporarily staying, and explained everything. He started with the DFAS envelope and ended with the audio recording, and he watched his father's face move through confusion, disbelief, comprehension, and finally, a grief so deep and so quiet that it frightened Jake more than any panic attack ever had. Nathan sat in silence for 11 minutes after Jake finished speaking. Then he said, "How long?" Jake said, "3 years, Dad, since you came home." Nathan nodded slowly, and Jake could see him doing the mental arithmetic, counting every morning that Diane had handed him his pills with a smile. Every evening she had tucked a blanket around his shoulders. Every time she had said, "Don't worry, honey, I'm taking care of everything." 20 years of marriage collapsed in Nathan's mind like a building with its foundation removed, floor by floor, memory by memory. "She told me the VA called every week," Nathan said. "She told me they said I was doing well." Jake took his father's hand, a gesture that would have been unimaginable between them 3 years ago, when Nathan was still the strong one. "You're going to get real help now, Dad. Dr. Okafor is the real deal. And I'm not going anywhere." Nathan looked at his son, and for the first time since the IED, he cried. Not the silent tears of a nightmare or the choked sounds of a panic attack, but the open, unrestrained weeping of a man who had finally been given permission to grieve. The trial of Diane Reed, Victor Hale, and Craig Wesson took place the following October, nearly a year after the arrests, in the United States District Court for the Middle District of Tennessee, Nashville Division. The prosecution, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Marcus Webb, brought a 17-count indictment that included conspiracy to commit murder, fraud against the United States government under Title 18, larceny of government property exceeding $200,000, identity theft for the unauthorized use of Nathan's personal information in financial transactions, wire fraud, insurance fraud, forgery of official military documents, and obstruction of justice. The case was prosecuted in federal court rather than military court because the conspiracy involved both military and civilian defendants and crossed jurisdictional boundaries between military and civilian fraud statutes. The courtroom gallery was filled every day with military families, veterans advocacy groups, and reporters from outlets that ranged from the local Leaf Chronicle to the Associated Press, all drawn by a case that had become a national symbol of how the system could fail the people it was designed to protect. The evidence presentation lasted 9 days and featured testimony from 22 witnesses, including Agent Fontaine, Dr. Okafor, Craig Wesson, who testified for the prosecution under his cooperation agreement, Mrs. Patterson from Army Human Resources, for Blanchfield Army Community Hospital doctors whose signatures had been forged on Nathan's phantom medical records, a DFAS forensic accountant who traced every dollar of the $241,000 through the Volunteer Federal Credit Union account, and a digital forensics expert from CID, who authenticated Victor Hale's monthly reconciliation spreadsheet and demonstrated that the file's metadata showed it had been created 34 months ago and updated on the first of every month since. Diane's defense attorney argued that Diane had been financially desperate and emotionally overwhelmed by the burden of caring for a severely disabled veteran without adequate support from the military or the VA, and that her actions, while illegal, were driven by survival rather than malice. This narrative disintegrated under cross-examination when the prosecution played the audio recording of Diane and Victor discussing the staged suicide. If Nathan were to have an episode, a bad one, and if his medication were somehow easier to access than it should be, no one would question it, Diane's own voice said through the courtroom speakers. The jury heard a woman who was not overwhelmed or desperate, but calculating and impatient. A woman who described her husband's potential death as ensuring that our investment pays out. The prosecution also presented the Secure Vault storage unit's contents, which FBI agents had inventoried during the search warrant execution. Designer clothing worth approximately $18,000, jewelry purchased from 3 different Nashville stores totaling $11,000, and a leather weekender bag containing $47,000 in cash bundled with rubber bands. This was not the spending pattern of a desperate caregiver. Victor Hale's defense was simpler and equally unsuccessful. He claimed he had only manipulated the personnel records and had no knowledge of the insurance policy or the murder plan. The prosecution demolished this claim with text messages between Victor and Diane that explicitly referenced the policy and the timeline on 14 separate occasions over 8 months. One message from Victor, sent 3 months before the arrests, read, "When the policy pays out, I want the Tahoe paid off first. Then we disappear." Another, sent 2 weeks before Jake found the DFAS envelope, read, "The new BC is asking about Nathan's file. We need to accelerate before this whole thing falls apart." The most damaging testimony came from Dr. Okafor, who explained to the jury in precise clinical terms what 3 years of untreated PTSD had done to Nathan's brain and body, and how Diane's deliberate isolation of Nathan from VA services had not only prolonged his suffering, but had created the exact psychological conditions that would make a staged suicide plausible. Mrs. Reed did not merely neglect her husband's treatment, Dr. Okafor testified. She actively engineered his deterioration. She ensured that every pathway to recovery was blocked, every support system was severed, and every professional who might have helped him was told that he did not want to be helped. This was not indifference. This was architecture. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. They returned guilty verdicts on all counts for all 3 defendants. Diane Reed was sentenced to 27 years in federal prison for conspiracy to commit murder, fraud against the United States, larceny of government property, identity theft, wire fraud, insurance fraud, and obstruction of justice. The judge, a retired Army JAG officer named the Honorable Margaret Chen, addressed Diane directly during sentencing. "You exploited a wounded warrior's trust, his disability, and his love for you to fund a lifestyle built on his suffering. You then conspired to end his life when the financial scheme was at risk of exposure. This court has seen many forms of betrayal, but seldom one so calculated, so sustained, and so devoid of the most basic human decency." Victor Hale was sentenced to 22 years for conspiracy to commit murder, fraud against the United States, forgery of military documents, larceny of government property, and obstruction of justice. His rank was reduced to Private E1, he forfeited all pay and allowances, and he received a dishonorable discharge from the United States Army, the most severe form of military separation. Craig Wesson, who had cooperated fully with the prosecution, received 4 years for insurance fraud and forgery. His insurance license was permanently revoked in Tennessee and flagged in the National Insurance Producer Registry, effectively ending his career in any state. The courtroom was silent for a long moment after the last sentence was read. In the gallery, several veterans who had followed the case in the news sat with their jaws set and their hands folded. Men and women who understood in their bones what it meant to come home from war and trust that the people waiting for you would protect you the way you had protected them. Nathan sat in the courtroom on the last day of the trial, in the front row, behind the prosecution table. He was not the same man who had sat in a recliner 11 months earlier, unable to process the sight of his wife being led away in handcuffs. 9 months of intensive PTSD treatment had not erased his trauma, and Dr. Okafor had been careful to explain that it never would. But it had given him tools to manage it, language to describe it, and enough cognitive clarity to understand what had been done to him. When the verdicts were read, Nathan closed his eyes and bowed his head, and Jake, sitting beside him, put his hand on his father's shoulder and left it there. When the judge invited victim impact statements, Nathan stood, walked to the podium with a steadiness that would have been impossible a year earlier, and spoke in the quiet, measured voice of a man who had spent 20 years leading soldiers and was now leading himself through the most difficult briefing of his life. "I served my country for 20 years. I was wounded in a way that doesn't leave visible scars, and I came home to the one person I believed would help me heal. Instead, she made sure I stayed broken. She didn't just steal my money. She stole 3 years of treatment that could have helped me learn to live with what happened in Kandahar. She stole my connection to the army family that I served with for 2 decades. She stole my ability to be a father to my son during the years when he needed me most. He paused, steadied himself, and continued. I don't know what my life would look like today if I had received treatment 3 years ago instead of 3 months ago. But I know that I am standing here today because my son had the courage to look at a piece of paper and ask a question that nobody else was asking. Jake saved my life. Not the way I once saved lives in combat, with weapons and tactics. He saved it with a pay stub and the refusal to look away. The recovery was neither fast nor linear, but it was real. Nathan enrolled in a residential PTSD treatment program at the VA's facility in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, spending 8 weeks in intensive therapy that combined prolonged exposure, cognitive processing therapy, and a carefully managed medication protocol that replaced the haphazard regimen Diane had maintained to keep him sedated rather than treated. For the first time in 3 years, Nathan sat in a room with other veterans who understood what it meant to hear a car backfire and feel the concussive wave of an IED that detonated 6,000 miles and 3 years away. He learned that his reaction was not weakness, but neurology, his brain's alarm system functioning exactly as it had been designed to function in a combat zone, unable to recalibrate because no one had helped it learn that the war was over. By spring, Nathan could sit on the porch of his new apartment in Clarksville, a modest 2-bedroom unit that Jake had helped him find, and watch cars drive past without flinching. He could cook a simple meal without his hands shaking. He could sleep for 5 consecutive hours most nights, which Dr. Okafor told him was remarkable progress, and which Nathan, who remembered sleeping 8 hours without dreaming, accepted as the new normal. The most meaningful change, though, was not physical, but social. During treatment at Murfreesboro, Nathan reconnected with Ray Dominguez, his old platoon sergeant, who had not transferred to Germany as Diane had claimed, but had been living 30 miles away in Springfield, Tennessee for the past 4 years. Ray had tried to call Nathan 6 times after his return from Afghanistan, and every time Diane had told him that Nathan was not taking visitors and needed space. Ray had respected those wishes because that was what you did for a brother who was hurting. When Nathan called him from the VA facility, Ray drove to Murfreesboro within the hour, walked into the day room, and hugged Nathan so hard that both men had to sit down afterward. I thought you didn't want to see me, Ray said. I thought you wanted to forget about all of us. Nathan shook his head. I didn't even know you called. They sat together for 3 hours that first visit, and Ray came back every Saturday for the remaining 6 weeks of Nathan's residential treatment. By the time Nathan moved into his apartment in Clarksville, he had a phone full of contacts from his old unit, men and women who had been told by Diane that Nathan wanted to be left alone, and who now understood that the isolation had never been Nathan's choice. Jake graduated from Clarksville High School that June as the class salutatorian. His graduation speech was about service, not the kind that involved uniforms and deployments, though he honored that kind too, but the kind that involved paying attention to the people around you and having the courage to act when something was wrong, even if the person causing the harm was someone you loved. He did not mention his mother by name. He did not need to. Everyone in the auditorium knew the story that had been covered by every news outlet from the Leaf Chronicle to the New York Times. Nathan sat in the second row, wearing a clean button-down shirt and khakis, his back straight for the first time in years, and when Jake stepped off the stage, Nathan stood and hugged his son with both arms and held him for a long time. I'm proud of you, Nathan said, his voice steady and clear. Not for the investigation, not for the evidence. I'm proud of you because you saw someone suffering and you chose not to look away. That's what a good soldier does, Jake. That's what a good man does." Jake smiled, and for the first time in over a year, the smile reached his eyes. Nathan returned to part-time work that fall, taking a position as a logistics coordinator at a veteran-owned construction company in Clarksville, a job that used the organizational skills the Army had spent 20 years teaching him, without requiring him to be on a job site where sudden noises and unpredictable movement could trigger a flashback. He also began volunteering with the Tennessee chapter of the Wounded Warrior Project, speaking at events about the dangers of caregiver isolation and financial exploitation of disabled veterans, topics that he was uniquely qualified to address. The case also prompted institutional change. The Army Inspector General launched a review of all Soldier Recovery Unit personnel records nationwide, identifying 3 additional cases of soldiers who had been kept on active duty rosters without their knowledge or consent, 2 at Fort Campbell and 1 at Joint Base Lewis McChord. The review led to new automated safeguards in IPPSA that required biometric verification for quarterly progress reviews and flagged any soldier who had been in transition status for more than 12 months without a completed MEB. Agent Fontaine, who had led the CID investigation, was awarded the Army's Outstanding Civilian Service Medal for her work on the case. In her acceptance remarks, she said, "The real investigator in this case was a 17-year-old high school junior who walked into my office with a pay stub and more courage than most adults I've worked with in my career." DFAS initiated a recoupment process for the $241,000 in fraudulent pay, but Army legal assistance attorneys helped Nathan file a waiver, transferring the full debt to Diane and Victor as court-ordered restitution, rather than holding Nathan responsible for money he had never received or known about. The Army then processed Nathan's actual medical discharge retroactively, crediting him with 20 years of active service and awarding him a medical retirement at 70% disability with full benefits, including the GI Bill transfer to Jake that Diane had never filed. Jake enrolled at Middle Tennessee State University that fall, majoring in criminal justice, with his tuition fully covered by his father's transferred GI Bill benefits. On weekends, Jake drove to his father's apartment, and they worked together on the 1969 Chevelle that had been sitting in a storage unit since the move. The same car they had been restoring before the deployment, before the IED, before everything. They did not talk about Diane often. But one Sunday afternoon, with Jake under the car adjusting the exhaust manifold and Nathan handing him tools, Nathan said something that Jake would carry with him for the rest of his life. "You know what the hardest part of all of this was? It wasn't the money or the betrayal or even the murder plan. The hardest part was realizing that the person who was supposed to help me recover was the one making sure I never did. But you know what? She underestimated 2 things. She underestimated how strong a broken soldier can be when someone finally gives him a reason to fight. And she underestimated what a 17-year-old kid with a pay stub and a conscience can do when he decides that his father's life is worth saving." Jake slid out from under the car, wiped the grease from his hands, and said, "You taught me that, Dad. Every fishing trip, every Sunday football game, every time you showed me what it looked like to take care of the people you love. You taught me everything I needed to know. I just had to remember it when it counted." They finished the exhaust manifold that afternoon, and for the first time in 3 years, Nathan started the Chevelle's engine. It turned over on the second try, and the sound of it rumbling in the quiet Sunday air was the sound of something old and damaged coming back to life. Justice had been served. The guilty were punished. The innocent were healing. And they had made it through together. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section below. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. We will see you in the next one.